Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Hello, pigeons. You guys flocked back here. Amazing. So I want to just start off today by thanking two people in the audience. So first, Vanessa Shaw, who introduced me to this wonderful event. Vanessa, just stand up real quick. You may be following her on Twitter. If you're not, please do. And then Susan O'Malley, who's over here, who actually helped me in the early iterations of this presentation and of this thinking. And thanks to all of you, because 3 months ago, I was a director and general manager at Amazon Web Services. I left because I thought I had something to say about building really great culture. And by you all being here, you've already validated my decision to go and speak about this and write about this and really try to help organizations understand culture as a business competitive advantage and as a business issue as opposed to some feel-good, wishy-washy thing. So that's what I hope today helps you have a framework that you can take back to your organizations, talk to your senior leadership, and actually build and manage your teams better. So I'm also going to, I heard a couple of comments yesterday that people wanted a little bit more time to reflect and take some of the learnings back to their own organization. So I'm going to put in a few moments that you can do that in this presentation. Yeah? Sounds like a good plan? All right. So here we go. The first thing I want to have you do is take a look at the companies on the left and the companies on the right. And I want to ask you, what distinguishes the companies on the left from the companies on the right? I'm going to give you some choices. Is what makes the companies on the left different from the ones on the right? Is it great technology? Who thinks that great technology is the difference between these? Okay. Is it an innovative business model? Is it access to capital and investors? But is there a certain group that you would prefer your company be like versus the other group? So what is it that distinguishes them? Right. And so the whole point of this is that culture is not just a feel-good thing. It actually affects business results and business outcomes. We've all heard the saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, I'm going to tell you that culture actually is strategy. It's the foundation for your strategic decision-making and your ability to execute on any goal or any plan that you have, right? So culture actually is strategy. It doesn't just eat it for breakfast. There is no distinction between the two. And culture is not the types of things that I often hear, which are kombucha on tap, or foosball tables, or fun office furniture, right? As Patty McCord said yesterday, there are some things that are employee perks, right? But those things are not culture. Culture is your ability to have a foundation set up for the people in your organization to achieve the goals of your organization in an effective way, right? It has nothing to do with foosball tables, right? Or Friday happy hours. And what we're starting to see more and more is that boards of directors and investors are actually starting to challenge executives to see culture as a hard issue as opposed to a soft issue. Now, what does a hard issue mean? And do you have the tools in your organization to actually start transitioning and talking about culture in the same ways, with the same rigor that you talk about management or financial planning or those types of things, right? And so what I'm trying to do today is give you guys some frameworks, some starting points to think about culture as a hard issue as opposed to a squishy, soft issue. The first question that I often get is, what is culture? I am a cultural anthropologist focusing on economic anthropology. I did my field work in Russia, all over Russia, and I actually traveled the Trans-Siberian twice and went from Russia to Mongolia. Here's the border that I crossed between Russia and Mongolia. something very interesting happens on that border. At the Russian checkpoint, you go in and you need to get your passport stamped to leave the country. And everybody lines up in a very orderly way. There's no talking. Everybody's patiently waiting. They slide their passport, into the window. The woman stamps the passport. The next person moves on. You cross the border just a couple hundred yards away to the Mongolian border. Has anyone actually been on this border before? No? Okay. You cross the border just a couple hundred yards away, and then something very strange starts to happen. It's a mob scene, right? Everybody's pushing and shoving and sort of trying to angle their way through. They're trying to slide their passports under the window, like really, really quickly. And this is completely strange, right? Because the same people who just a few minutes ago, like 15 minutes ago, were lining up in an orderly way are now pushing and screaming and creating a mob scene. What's happened? Well, that's culture, right? Culture sets the context for how people behave. There are certain rules, there are certain norms that people ascribe to based on what they know they're expected to do. The other thing about culture is it's a self-reinforcing system. Because in Russia, if you get out of line, you try to cut through the line and you try to shove your passport under the window, the people in the line will discipline you, right? They will say, hey, you, get to the back of the line is over here, right? So it's self-reinforcing because people know that they have the power to reinforce the norms and the rules within that particular context, right? So that is culture. It's greater than psychology. It allows people to make decisions, but decisions that are framed within the conditions of the context and what we in anthropology say, the conditions of possibility for behaving in a particular way. Okay? So culture really matters. It matters more than a few bad apples, unless those bad apples are at the very top of the organization, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And this happens again and again in other contexts. Has anybody crossed the bridge between Malaysia and Singapore? Yes. So how do people drive in Singapore? Very orderly. And then what happens when they cross the bridge? Yeah, so again, it happens over and over again. You can see that context and culture frames behavior over and over and over again. You can see this in natural experiments all over the world. So you might have one employee in a particular organizational culture behave one way and then shift over to a different one and behave a completely different way, right? Because the norms of that organization are set up in a very different way, okay? So culture really matters. And boards and investors are starting to understand that the behaviors that are set up and the contexts that are set up really influence financial performance. BlackRock, one of the biggest institutional investors in the world, has said that they are expecting their boards to answer for their oversight of corporate culture. Pretty amazing. Who thinks that their CEO is ready to answer questions about corporate culture at the level that they're ready to answer questions about financial? Okay. Wow. Okay. Who here thinks that their CEO is not quite ready to answer questions about corporate culture, right? So our job is to help our CEOs and our executives really get ready with the tools, right, to talk about corporate culture in the same way that they talk about management or finance or cybersecurity. They know about financial risk, they know about product risk, they know how to talk about regulatory risk, they know how to talk about cybersecurity risk, but do they know really how to talk about culture risk? Do they know what types of risks they're taking on by either not managing their culture actively from the top levels of the organization, right? And do they know how to manage it proactively moving forward, right? And how can we help our executives really traverse that terrain? So healthy organizations actively measure and manage 5 culture risks, which I'll talk through right now. Okay, so here are the 5, and I'll walk through them each one by one. They are scaling risk, fragmentation risk, attrition risk, conformity risk, and stagnation risk. So the first one is scaling risk. How many of you guys are in fast-scaling organizations right now? Does the culture ever feel wobbly as you're scaling? Do you feel like you're kind of losing your footing? Do you feel like things are kind of getting really slippery and difficult to manage as you scale? So when you think about scaling, what we often think of is scaling happens like smooth curves up and to the right, up to the moon. That's not really how it happens. How it really happens is that scaling happens in fits and starts and bumps, right? And that's why you start to wobble along the way. And there's a ton of research around this. There's a group of professors at Stanford. Bob Sutton is involved in some of this research. He wrote a great book, Scaling Up Excellence. And there are known inflection points at which you need to really re-examine your cultural and organizational model to see how to take it to the next level. So the first inflection point is around 40 people. So around that number, you have a situation in which at first you're all kind of sitting in a room together, the CEO can see everyone, you hire a bunch of generalists, anybody can do anything, right? Does this sound familiar, right? And the CEO can just manage through personal relationships, right? They're like, Sally, why don't you go do this? You're good at that. Bob, why don't you go do this, right? You're interested in that, right? That management style, that cultural style, is the thing that actually attracts a lot of people to early startups, right? But after about 30 or 40 people, it starts to break down. You can't manage that way anymore, right? You can't just stand up on a chair and look around the room and see all of the employees in your organization and sort of have your pulse on what everyone's doing in that way, right? So the organizational model needs to be redesigned at around 40 people. The next inflection point is around 140 to 150 people, right? This is the point at which it's very hard to keep all the personalities even in mind for one individual, right? So you start to lose track. People start to get lost in the system unless there are models and structures and some process that's involved, right, to keep track of what everyone is doing and to rationalize their roles and to make sure people aren't stepping on each other's toes, right? So that's the next inflection point. And then the next one is around 700. And 700 is the point at which you really start to build for enterprise scale. You have to think about business units. You have to think about career paths in a very structured way. You have to have different types of communication and coordination processes to really manage for enterprise scale that comes, as you scale up from 700, right? So these are known inflection points, and if they're not managed proactively, and you don't have people and executives sort of looking at, really looking at where are we right now in our growth, you start to take on a lot of risk. At Amazon, I was the second hire for a brand new team, and we scaled to 150 people in a year and a half, which was pretty fast. So we went from 2 to 150 in a year and a half. And I remember at one point, I was having a staff meeting, and I called it the swarm, the weekly swarm, with all the people on the team. And we were about 12 or 14 at the time. And I looked around the room, and I said, holy crap, I know that I just hired another 30 people to come into the organization in the next 3 weeks. This is not going to work anymore. This meeting is the primary way by which I manage how the team gets coordinated and how we share information is not going to work at 45, right? In the same way that it's working now. And it felt so good. It felt so good to get together with everyone in a room. Everybody got to share, everybody got to talk, we got to, solve problems together. It was fantastic. But I knew in my head what was coming, and so we had to do away with that meeting, or we had to redesign that meeting to be more of a traditional staff meeting where ICs were no longer invited and we had different layers of meetings and coordination and communication, right? So that's the thing that you have to help your leadership with, to say, when are those points coming, right? How can we see a few weeks or a few months ahead so that we can design the organization as consciously as we think about the product design, as consciously as we think about the long-term trajectory, right, of what our organization will need as we move forward. Okay? Make sense? All right. The second one is fragmentation risk. Fragmentation risk is easiest to describe in engineering organizations, or organizations that start as engineering organizations. Anybody work in a company that started as an engineering organization? Yeah, a lot of us. And so you have a group of engineers, they've got their own culture, they've got their own thing going, and then your VCs say, you gotta have a sales team, you need to focus on sales ops, and then a whole bunch of salespeople come in, and then you've got two different subcultures. Sound familiar? Right? And so when you've got this fragmentation of different types of cultures and subcultures, the job is to really figure out, what are you going to do? There's generally two ways to manage this. The first is to step back and design a dominant culture, right? Which will morph both of these, right? And have them come together in a unified culture that's not going to be either one or the other. The second is to keep them separate. And this sometimes happens, especially with acquisitions, right? Where companies decide that they're going to keep an acquisition, pretty separate. They're going to allow them to keep their own sort of subculture. But then you have to manage the interfaces, right, between those different teams in a very, very conscious way. So then you have a different design problem on the culture side. How do you design how these different teams and how these different subcultures are going to interact, right? What are the meetings within which they will interact? What are the communication channels within which they would interact? Where will they not interact, right? Are they going to have a different building or a different space so they don't just bump into each other sort of in undesigned and unplanned ways, right? And so the interfaces between fragmented subcultures really need to be thought through and designed, right? Almost like how the interfaces between different software components need to be designed, right? It's a very similar mental model. The next is attrition risk. All companies face attrition. That is perfectly natural, that is perfectly normal. As Patty McCord said, there's going to be times when people leave your organization, and as long as it's a great place to be from, that is a perfectly acceptable thing, right? Attrition is not a bad thing. When it becomes a risk is when it's not managed proactively. When it hits you by surprise, or you have a wave of a lot of people going, and you try to fill them with similar people, even though the actual skill sets that your company needs have changed, right? So when you're not proactively managing out for what are the new types of skill sets, what are the new types of mindsets, what are the new types of people that we need for the next phase of growth, how are we going to get to the next phase, how are we going to take us to the next place, right? That needs to all be designed through kind of a pipeline planning approach. And sometimes you actually want to encourage waves of attrition, because that'll allow you to refresh your company in a proactive way, right? So attrition is fine. When it becomes a risk is when it's not proactively managed and designed. The next one is conformity risk. So conformity risk is the flip side of the diversity and inclusion conversation. The best way for me to explain what a conformity risk is to put up the next slide, and as you look at it, I want you to put up your hand and leave it up if it looks like any company that you know. So take a look. Does this look like any company that you know? All right. So a lot of hands went up. Not as many as usual. Usually, like 100% of the hands go up because they're like, yeah, I worked in a company where all the top executives were either men or white or, you know. So does this make sense as to why conformity at the top layers of the organization is actually a business risk? Right? Having people who represent your frontline employees and having people who represent your customer base at the top levels of the organization making the most fundamental strategic decisions is not something that we do because we feel good about it. It's something that we do because it is actually a significant business risk to do otherwise. And I'm not the only person who thinks that. There have been numerous studies that have come out that have shown again and again and again that when you have top management that reflects your customer base, you will get better financial performance, right? And specifically, this is a study that came out from Bank of America Merrill Lynch, not a particularly feminist organization, I would say, that has shown, you know, that having female executives, right, in companies actually influences financial performance in a significant way, right? And so conformity is a business risk. It's not something that's just something that we, you know, we don't like how it feels, right? All right, and then the last one is stagnation risk. Stagnation risk happens when the processes and the approaches of a company start to ossify and you can't get truly creative ideas through the organization's pipeline to market. Adam talked about this a lot yesterday, right? It's the number of ideas in organizations is often very large, right? Ideas are cheap. A lot of people have ideas, but sometimes just the culture of the organization ossifies and those ideas can't get through to market. And so what the organization ends up doing is calling, you know, innovation just the same box in a different color, right? They just keep rebranding and repainting the same basic ideas because, as Adam said yesterday, what's been tried before is what innovation looks like, right? And you can't get anything else out of the organization. And so at that point, you're taking on a huge amount of risk, right? Because that allows the organization to be disrupted from the outside, right? By another startup or another organization that could actually build something truly unique and different to meet the needs of customers, right? So those are the 5 risks. Your organization, whether you or your executives see it, your organization is being pulled by these 5 risks in the background all the time. So I want you to take a minute and take a look at these 5 risks: scaling risk, fragmentation risk, attrition risk, conformity risk, and stagnation risk, and write down what 1 or 2 risks is your company facing that your executives are not either seeing or not managing well, in your opinion. Okay? Take a minute. All right. Quick show of hands. Who thinks scaling risk is one of the top things? Yeah, not surprising. Scaling risk is often the underlying issue for other risks as well. How about fragmentation? Lots of subcultures. Ah, that's a big one. Attrition? Conformity. Conformity. And then stagnation. All right, we've got a pretty even spread, right, in terms of the types of risks that are happening in the organization. So the next question is, so what do you do? How do you manage this? Well, in this model, the organization, usually people imagine the organization as a pyramid. I like to imagine it as a series of concentric circles that are emanating out from the center, right? So it's the CEO at the center, then their executive team, managers, and employees. And at each layer of the organization, companies that effectively manage their cultures do the following thing, and it's really consistent across the board as I was looking at lots of different organizations and thinking about which ones manage their cultures really well. The thing that they all have in common is that the CEO and the executive team do a very similar thing, and they either do it consciously or unconsciously, and they put in the following anchors. They define very robust principles, very clear principles that guide the behavior of the organization. They create mechanisms to make sure that people don't have to make a whole bunch of decisions about whether to adhere to these principles or not. They follow the mechanisms, and so the principles come out from the organization, and then they monitor the behaviors that are happening within their organization at all levels, consistently. Okay? So with these three anchors in place, principles, mechanisms, and behaviors, they then create alignment across the organization so that the principles cascade out from the CEO all the way through the organization. There are mechanisms that are designed, I'll talk about all three of these in a second. There are mechanisms that are designed to behave and make sure that people are aligned and acting according to the principles. And then there are consistent behavior monitors that happen throughout the organization, right? In the form of oftentimes daily surveys or a daily survey question, right? Oftentimes, through monitoring of actual things like expense reports and actual behavior monitors of not just what people say, but what they do. And more actually in the monitoring of things like email, right? In terms of who's connecting with whom, are people being collaborative, are they sharing information, those types of things, right? And internal social media networks, right? In terms of figuring out the social dynamics and the social mapping of how people are actually behaving within the organization. So the alignment of principles, mechanisms, and behaviors within an organization is how to effectively manage your culture. So then, and when I say effectively manage your culture, you're going to hear me say the word effective culture several times. What I'm not going to say are things like good culture and bad culture, right? How many times have we heard like, oh, does this company have a good culture? Does this company have a bad culture? And I'm going to echo something that I think Patty McCord said yesterday, which is, there's really no such thing as a good culture or a bad culture from an objective point of view. The question is your culture effective in getting to your business goals? And does everybody, from the internal employees that are already here to the prospective employees that may be looking at your organization, do they know what's expected of them once they get into our organization, right? So when you cross the border into Mongolia, unless you're an idiot American like me, right, you know what's expected of you, and you behave accordingly, even if you behaved a completely different way in the previous context, right? So we don't want to talk about good culture and bad culture. We want to talk about, is our culture getting us to our business goals? And are we attracting the right types of people by making our principles known in the world? And are we monitoring the behaviors of our people internally to make sure they're behaving in accordance with the culture that we think will be effective for what we're trying to achieve. Make sense? And culture strategy, and this is where we start to talk about culture strategy, is the thing that will ensure that your company achieves its goals. Okay, so you really have to outline a strategy for culture design in the same way that you outline your strategy for anything else. So first, principles. What are principles? They are the written down, clear and concise agreements that govern the culture. We heard a lot of people talk about values yesterday. I talk about principles, and there's a couple of reasons why. The first is that values are often one or two words that are written on a plaque or painted on a wall, right? Anybody with me here, right? And those words can be interpreted subjectively in many different ways. What I do with executive teams, especially with founders, they often have values, but a lot of times what I do is I help take them from values to principles. And principles, the difference, values are a great place to start, but for example, I worked with a executive team, a founder team recently, and they had the value of transparency. And I said, okay, let's really take that to ground and make that a principle. What does that mean, right? If there are 3 founders, if 2 of you walk out of this room and have a side conversation with each other without including the 3rd founder, is that a violation of the transparency value? And they were like, well, I'm not sure about that, right? They say, okay, here's another example. If one of you decides not to share your calendar with either the other 2 founders or with the rest of the organization, is that a violation of the transparency value? Right? And so what we want to do is we want to take it down and they disagreed, actually. When you actually start to ask these more precise questions and get to the point of what are really our operating principles, when you just have a value like transparency or inclusion, you don't know how to make those decisions. You want principles that are for decision making, right? Principles help you make decisions, right? Values are often just the things that I value, right? So we want to get really concrete about what does this mean in order to make decisions across the organization, right? So that's the level of granularity that we're looking for when we define the principles. And back to the first slide that I showed you guys, it's very interesting that all 3 of the very, very successful, fast-scaling companies developed very conscious and concise and clear principles from the very beginning. If you read Jeff Bezos's shareholder letter from 1997, there are at least 5 of the leadership principles that currently exist. There are currently 14. But he starts to articulate the principles by which the company will operate from the very beginning. And there was a great interview with Jeff Bezos from late last year, where an interviewer asks him, what is Amazon exactly? Like, you started as a bookstore, now you've got web services, and you've got, Kindles, and you've got Alexa, and you're doing all this different stuff. And Jeff Bezos says, yeah, a lot of people don't really understand that Amazon is nothing more than an approach. At its core, Amazon is an approach based on some very specific and a small set of principles. Those are the leadership principles, and those are the things that the CEO spends most of his time on, really articulating and managing, because that is all that Amazon is, right? And he said, the most important one is customer obsession. That's the one you'll hear over and over again, because that's the one that guides our decision-making fundamentally over and over again, right? And he says, we're not technology-focused, we're not product-focused, we're not competitor-focused. We're really focused on our approach around these principles, right? Netflix as well, we heard from Patty McCord in terms of creating that culture deck and creating the principles by which the organization would scale and grow. And then you heard Adam Grant talk about Bridgewater yesterday. Ray Dalio, if you haven't seen it, has written a book on the principles that have created the success of his company, right? So great organizations start with clear and directive principles that help people make decisions. And they guide hiring, they guide promotions, they guide decision-making, all of those things. And you'll see that those principles come up again and again in the mechanisms that are designed across the organization. Now, a lot of people look at the slide and they're like, oh, those cultures, I wouldn't want to work in those cultures. You know, they're all cutthroat. Tatyana, do you really want us to be like Amazon and Bridgewater? Those sound like terrible places to work. Well, it's funny because when you put yourself out there for who you really are, you will be surprised what the world brings back to you, right? When you put yourself out authentically, either as a person or as an organization, and are transparent about this is what it's like to work here, right? This is what we believe in. This is what's expected of you as an employee, and you follow through on that, and you have the reputation of following through on that, you may actually be more attractive than the place with the slides and the free lunch and the kombucha on tap. Funny thing how that works. All right, so behaviors, right? You can have these principles, but if people aren't behaving according to the principles, not a lot of it matters. So behaviors are the things we do and role model at every level of the organization that bring the culture to life, right? And at every layer of the organization, there are different behaviors that you really want to monitor. And I have to say, the thing that is often overlooked is the stories that the CEO and the executive team tell. And I'll tell you a little example of that in a minute. This is, anybody know who this is? Paula Deen? Did anybody remember the Paula Deen scandal? Okay. So I interviewed Susan Packard, who is the co-founder of the Scripps Networks, which own Food Network and HGTV. And she told me about this story. She said, firing Paula Deen was a no-brainer because we knew that one of our principles was inclusion. And so even though she was our number one celebrity at the time, we all knew that as soon as she made a comment and a statement that was counter to our principles, we had to fire her, right? And you can see the teary-eyed Paula Deen saying, I would not have fired me, right? Because of course, she's like, I brought in so much money, I'm the biggest celebrity that they have, right? But staying true to your principles and knowing how to act, right? That's the thing, the principles help them really know immediately how to act in the face of that. They did not hesitate, right? Because it was very clear what they stood for. And then the other thing is the stories that the CEO tells should never be ignored. These are two headlines. The first one is from 2013. Take a look. So in 2017, the board of directors of Uber came out and said, we were shocked, absolutely shocked to hear that Uber was a baller culture and the things that were going on at Uber. It's like, well, really? Because it feels to me like the CEO and the co-founder were very open and honest about what the culture was, and in fact, it was covered in the media as early as 2013, right? How could the board then claim to be shocked about the culture that was present, right? When the CEO and the co-founder were telling the world over and over again in the stories that they were going out in the world and saying, right, about what was going on, right? And the type of principles that were governing the cultural environment, right? So I'm often asked at this point, anybody have this question? Well, Uber was very successful with that culture, right? Why should they have fixed it? Well, again, this is about culture risk. You can be very successful and very lucky for a while, taking on a great deal of risk, right? You can make very speculative investments, you can take on a lot of risk, and you can get lucky for a while. But then you can get really unlucky as well when you take on a lot of risk. This type of storytelling, which manifested in a particular level of culture risk in terms of conformity risk within the organization, right, eventually, right, created problems. And so that is why this is all about the risk frameworks in terms of what's going on within the organization. Okay? And then finally, mechanisms. And this is really, really important, the hardest thing to do in many ways, because you don't want to just go on what is the best practice for other organizations. You need to invent and design mechanisms across your organization that will help bring your principles to life and help your people behave in accordance with the principles without them having to do a whole lot of extra work, okay? So mechanisms, at Amazon we did a lot of mechanism design, but mechanisms are the self-reinforcing systems, tools, and institutions that don't make the culture rely on good intentions, right? So you might say something, or the CEO might say something, or your head of HR might make a pronouncement, and the managers are like, yes, we totally intend to do that. And they might totally intend to do that. But then they go back to their old, budgeting processes and their old hiring processes and the things that were habitual and familiar because they're trying to save time. And then all those good intentions don't mean anything, right? Because the mechanisms haven't been redesigned. So here are some examples. The and-on cord is a great example. When Toyota wanted to create a culture of quality in Toyota factories, they didn't send an email to the managers of factories and say, quality is our #1 value, make sure everybody focuses on quality, right? Because intentionally, everybody wanted quality, right? That was not the problem. The problem was not that people intended to put out poor quality cars. The problem was that there were no mechanisms for people to actually act on that. And so they put in the and-on cord and then a reward system. So the and-on cord stops the line, and then everybody focuses on the quality defect. And then the person who pulled the cord gets rewarded. And then the team that solves the quality defect gets rewarded. Not punished, but rewarded, right? So that is the mechanism that actually brings quality from an intention to an actual behavior within the organization. Salesforce. Anybody here work at Salesforce? Yay! V2 Mom. How important is the V2 Mom?
Life-changing.
Life-changing. So, when you want alignment across the organization, does Mark Benioff just send an email to people and say, let's get aligned, everyone? But what happens?
It goes into the V2 Mom.
It goes into the V2 Mom, which is an internal tool to create alignment and force alignment across the organization from Mark Benioff's V2 Mom to the EVPs, to the SVPs, to the VPs, all the way through the organization, right? It's a really effective mechanism for alignment, right? Everybody might intend to align to the annual goals, but how do you create a mechanism that actually does that, right? And there's a ton of videos on the V2 Mom on the Salesforce website if you want to learn more. And then finally, this might be familiar to all of you, right? You guys have one-on-ones in your organizations? This is something that when you want to create regular communication between managers and employees, would it be enough to just tell managers, hey, talk regularly to your employee? No, because people get busy, right? They run out of time. So you put in the mechanism of the weekly one-on-one so that managers actually communicate with their employees, right? So these things become self-reinforcing to achieve the behaviors and bring to life the principles that you want in your organization. All right, so as you look at this, your next thing will be to say at what level, right, are you missing either the creation of principles or mechanisms or effective behavior monitors within your organization, or where are things out of alignment, Like for example, the executive team says that they value these things, but their behaviors are not aligned with that. Or we say we value these things, innovation, for example, but the mechanism of our annual planning and budgeting process does not align with the things that we say that we want. Okay, so just take a minute and say, at what layer of the organization are we most misaligned or missing either the mechanisms or the behavior monitors or a clear articulation of principles? Okay. Where is it, for a show of hands, where do people feel that the issues are at the top? At the top of the organization, by and large. And where do you guys think the issues are more at the bottom of the organization? Like the front line? Okay. All right. And across the organization? How about across the organization? So a pretty even spread there as well. Okay, so hopefully this has given you guys a good framework to start thinking about culture design. With some more discipline, right? Than some of the, like, you know, oh, culture is so difficult to put your arms around. We don't know what to do about it. Hopefully, this has given you some places to start. And one of the things that people say to me, and tell me if this rings true, is, I wish my executive team or my CEO had the time to think about culture, right? Or my CEO always tells me that he doesn't have the time or she doesn't have the time to think about culture. This is something they would really love to do, but there's just no time to do it, right? Or we're scaling too quickly, we're growing too quickly, right? For the executive team to take the time out to do this whole culture design, right? So question for you. Do you think that Amazon or Bridgewater or Netflix scaled too slowly? Anybody think that they scaled too slowly? Anybody think that your CEO would be happy if they scaled as quickly as Amazon? Right? So, but that is what it takes. The focus on the approach, the focus on the principles and the mechanisms is what it takes to scale effectively. And the person who said it best was Ray Dalio, who is the founder and CEO of the most successful hedge fund in the world. Talk about success, right? And he says, nothing is more important or more difficult than to get the culture and the people right. Whatever successes we've had at Bridgewater were the result of doing that well, and whatever failures were due to our not doing it adequately. That might seem odd, because one might think that I had to get the economics and investment right, the hard stuff, which is true. But to do that, I needed to get the people and culture right first. So the reason I'm here, and the reason I'm talking about this, is because the root cause of product success and market success and business success is getting the people and the culture right first. And then when you actually put in place those principles, mechanisms, and behaviors, you can pivot on the product. You can better listen to your customers, right? You can really focus on financial risk and get that right, right? The foundation is the people and the culture, and the most successful companies and CEOs know that. And I hope I provided a framework for you guys to take back to your organizations and start having this conversation as well to get to the same level of success. So thank you.